हॅलो फ्रेंड्स, आजपासून आपण लक्ष्मीकांतची एक एक एडिशन माझ्याकडे आहे. तर त्याचं आपण रीडिंग सुरू करणार आहे, म्हणजे ते आपल्याला रिव्हिजनला चांगलं कामी येईल. तर मग सुरुवात करूया. हे सुरुवातीला पार्ट्स दिलेले आहेत आणि त्याची प्रस्तावना दिलेली आहे. आपण डायरेक्ट टॉपिककडे जाऊया आणि आपण लक्ष्मीकांतचे संपूर्ण पार्ट्स घेणार आहोत. तर सुरुवातीला आपण छोट्या छोट्या टप्प्यामध्ये छोटे छोटे पार्ट्स कंप्लीट करूया, छोटे छोटे टॉपिक्स, आणि नंतर आपण ही संपूर्ण एडिशन कंप्लीट करणार आहोत. याचे आपले भाग होतील. आज थोडा भाग, उद्या थोडा भाग, असे करत आपण ही संपूर्ण एडिशन कंप्लीट करूया, जेणेकरून आपल्याला रिव्हिजनला याचा चांगला फायदा होईल. चला तर मग सुरू करूया. फर्स्ट टॉपिक आहे हिस्टॉरिकल बॅकग्राऊंड. हिस्टॉरिकल बॅकग्राऊंड. द ब्रिटिश केम टू इंडिया in 16th as traders in the form of East India Company, which had the exclusion right of trading in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth. In 1765, the company, which till now had purely trading functions, obtained the Diwani (rights over revenue and civil justice) of Bengal, Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. This started its career as a territorial power. In 1858, in the wake of the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India. This rule continued until India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. With independence came the need for a constitution. Hence, a constituent assembly was formed for this purpose in 1946, and on January 26, 1950, the constitution came into being. However, various features of the Indian constitution and polity have their roots in the British rule. There were certain events in the British rule that laid down the legal framework for the organization and functioning of government and administration in British India. These events have greatly influenced our constitution and polity. They are explained here in a chronological order under two major headings. First, the Company Rule, 1773 to 1858. Second, the Crown Rule, 1858 to 1947. Then next, Company Rule. कंपनी रूल केव्हापासून आहे तर 1773 पासून 1858. ओके, यामध्ये ॲक्ट्स आहेत. रेग्युलेटिंग ॲक्ट ऑफ 1773. This act was of great constitutional importance as first A. It was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. Second आहे B. It recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company. And C. It laid the foundations of central administration in India. ओके, म्हणजे हा जो ॲक्ट आहे 1773चा, हा ॲक्ट हा खूप महत्त्वाचा कायदा आहे आणि ह्याद्वारे 3 गोष्टी इम्प्लिमेंट झाल्या, म्हणजे तिन्ही गोष्टी घडलेल्या आहेत. 3 फीचर आहेत असं आपण म्हणू शकतो. त्याच्यामध्ये फर्स्ट इट वॉज लेट द फर्स्ट स्टेप. ब्रिटिश गव्हर्नमेंटचा जो कंट्रोल आणि रेग्युलेशनची जी फर्स्ट स्टेप आहे ते आपण 1773च्या ॲक्टला म्हणू शकतो. देन सेकंड आहे इट रेकग्नाइज फॉर द फर्स्ट टाईम द पॉलिटिकल अँड ॲडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव्ह फंक्शन ऑफ द कंपनी. याच्यामुळे पहिल्यांदाच आपल्याला कंपनीचे पॉलिटिकल आणि ॲडमिनिस्ट्रेशन फंक्शन कळाले किंवा समजले. इट लेट द फाउंडेशन ऑफ द सेंट्रल ॲडमिनिस्ट्रेशन इन इंडिया. केंद्रीय प्रशासनाचा पाया घातला या रेग्युलेटिंग ॲक्टने. ओके, आता याचे फीचर्स काय आहेत ते आपण बघूया. द फीचर्स Act where as follows. First, it designed the governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal, okay, and created an executive council of 4 members to assist him. The first such governor was Lord Warren Hastings. Okay, Lord Warren Hastings हा फर्स्ट गव्हर्नर जनरल आहे 1773च्या ॲक्टने. Then second आहे, it made the governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal, unlike earlier when the 3 presidencies were independent of one another. It provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court of Calcutta 1774 comprising 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges, म्हणजेच 1+3. Okay. Then it prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. Okay. It strengthened the control of the British government over the company by requiring the court of directors in bracket governing body of the company to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Okay. Then Amending Act of 1781 1781चा घटना दुरुस्ती कायदा. त्यात काय दिले? In a bid to rectify the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781, also known as the Act of Settlement. Act of Settlement असं सुद्धा म्हणतात. The feature of this act were as follows. First, it exempted the Governor General and the Council from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for the acts done by them in their official capacity. Similarly, it also exempted the servants of the company from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for their official actions. It excluded the revenue matters and the matters arising in the collection of revenue from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Third, it provided that the Supreme Court was to have jurisdiction over all the inhabitants of Calcutta. It also required the court to administer the personal law of the defendants, that is, Hindus were to be tried according to the Hindu law and Muslims were to be tried according to the Mohammedan law. It laid down that the appeals from the provincial court could be taken to the Governor General in Council and not to the Supreme Court. Fifth, it empowered the Governor General in Council to frame regulations for the provincial courts and councils. Next जो act है तो Pitt's India Act of 1784. 1784चा Pitt's India Act. The next important act was the Pitt's India Act of 1784. The features of this act were as follows. First, it distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. Second, it allowed the court of directors to manage the commercial affairs but created a new body called Board of Control to manage the political affairs. Thus, it established a system of double government. Third, it empowered the Board of Control to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and military government or revenues of the British possessions in India. Thus, the act was significant for 2 reasons. First, the company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India. And second, the British government was given the supreme control over company's affairs and its administration in India. The next आहे Act of 1786. In 1786, Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal. He placed two demands to accept that post. For example, first आहे it should be given power to override the decision of his council in special cases. Second आहे he would also be the commander in chief. Accordingly, the Act of 1786 was enacted to make both the provisions. The next आहे Chartered Act of 1793. The features of this act were as follows. First, it extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis over his council to all future Governor Generals and Governors of Presidencies. Second, it gave the Governor General more powers and control over the governments of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras. It extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for another period of 20 years. Fourth, it provided that the Commander-in-Chief was not to be a member of the Governor-General's Council unless he was so appointed. Fifth, it laid down the members of the Board of Control and their staff were henceforth to be paid out of the Indian revenues. Next act आहे Chartered Act of 1830. The features of this act were as follows. First, it abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. That is, the Indian trade was thrown open to all British merchants. However, it continued the monopoly of the company over trade in tea and trade with China. Second, it asserted the sovereignty of the British Crown over the company's territories in India. Third, it allowed the Christian missionaries to come to India for the purpose of enlightening the people. Fourth, it provided for the spread of Western education among the inhabitants of the British territories in India. Fifth, it authorized the local governments in India to impose taxes on persons. They could also punish the persons for not paying taxes. Next act is Chartered Act of 1833. This act was final step towards centralization in British India. The features of this act were as follows. It made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Thus, the act created for the first time Government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. Second, it deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. The laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while laws made under this act were called as acts. Third, it ended the activities of the East India Company as a commercial body, which became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust for His Majesty, his heirs and successors. Fourth, the Chartered Act of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants and stated that the Indians should not be debarred from holding any place, office and employment under the company. However, this provision was negated after opposition from the Court of Directors. Chartered Act of 1853. This was the last of the series of Chartered Acts passed by the British Parliament between 1793 and 1853. It was a significant constitutional landmark. The features of this act were as follows. First, it separated for the first time the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. It provided for addition of 6 new members called legislative councillors to the council. In other words, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. Thus, the legislation for the first time was treated as a special function of the government requiring special machinery and special process. It introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The convenanted civil service was thus thrown open to the Indian also. Accordingly, the Macaulay Committee the Committee of the Indian Civil Service was appointed in 1854. Third, it extended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust for the British Crown, but it did not specify any particular period, unlike the previous charters. This was a clear indication that the company's rule could be terminated at any time the parliament liked. Fourth, it introduced for the first time local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor General's Council, 4 members were appointed by the local governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. Then next act आहे the Crown Rule 1858 to 1947. हा क्राउन रूलचा पिरियड आहे. त्याच्यामधला हा ॲक्ट आहे गव्हर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया ॲक्ट 1858. This significant act was enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857, also known as the First War of Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. The act, known as the Act of the Good Government of India, abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers of government, territories, and revenues to the British Crown. The features of this act were as follows. First, it provided that India henceforth was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. It changed the designation of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. He, means Viceroy, was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of India. It ended the system of double government by abolishing the Board of Control and Court of Directors. It created a new office, Secretary of State for India, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was responsible ultimately to the British Parliament. Fourth, it established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. The Council was an advisory body. The Secretary of State was made the chairman of the Council. Fifth, the constitute the Secretary of State in Council as a body corporate, capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined to the improvement of the administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. Next act है Indian Councils Act of 1861. After the Great Revolt of 1857, the British government felt the necessity of seeking the cooperation of the Indians in the administration of their country. In pursuance of this policy of association, three acts were enacted by the British Parliament in 1861, 1892, 1909. 18 Council Act 1861, 1892 and 1909. The Indian Council Acts of 1861 is an important landmark in the constitutional and political history of India. The features of this act were as follows. First, it made a beginning of the representative institutions by associating Indians with the law-making process. It thus provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as non-official members of his expanded council. In 1862, Lord Canning, the then Viceroy, nominated three Indians to his legislative council. First, the Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala, Sir Dinkar Rao. The second है it initiated the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidencies. It thus reversed the centralizing tendency that went from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This policy of legislative devolution resulted in the grant of almost complete internal autonomy to the provinces in 1937. Third, it also provided for the establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal, northwestern provinces, and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1886, and 1897 respectively. It empowered the Viceroy to make rules and orders for the more convenient transaction of business in the council. It also gave a recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. Under this, a member of the Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the Council on matters of his department. Fifth, it empowered the Viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence of the Legislative Council during an emergency. The life of such an ordinance was 6 months. Next act है Indian Councils Act of 1892. The features of this act were as follows. First, it increased the number of additional members in the central and provincial legislative councils, but maintained the official majority in them. It increased the functions of legislative councils and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executive. Third, it provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and that of the Provincial Legislative Councils by the governors on the recommendation of the district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars, and chambers. Next, the act made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in filling up some of the non-official seats both in the central and provincial legislative councils. The word election was, however, not used in the act. The process was described as nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies. नेक्स्ट ॲक्ट आहे इंडियन काउन्सिल्स ॲक्ट ऑफ 1909. This act is also known as Morley-Minto reforms. In bracket, Lord Morley was then Secretary of State for India, and Lord Minto was then Viceroy of India. Lord Morley, Secretary of State for India. Lord Minto was Viceroy of India. The features of this act were as follows. First, it considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, both central and provincial. The number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The number of members in the provincial legislative councils was not uniform. Second, it retained official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the provincial legislative councils to have non-official majority. Third, it enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. Fourth, Fourth, it provided for the first time for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's executive council. He was appointed as the law member. Fifth, it introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. Thus, the act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. 6. It also provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, university and zamindars. नेक्स्ट ॲक्ट आहे गव्हर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया ॲक्ट 1990. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. The Government of India Act of 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. This act is also known as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of State for India. Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. The features of this act were as follows. First, it relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. The central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. It further divided the provincial subjects into two parts, transport and resort. The transport subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative council. The resort subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy, a term derived from the Greek word diarchy, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. Third, it introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house and a lower house. The majority of members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. Fourth, it required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's executive councils other than the commanders in chief were to be Indian. Fifth, it extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikhs, Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. Sixth, it granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or education. 7. It created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions thereto performed by the Secretary of State for India. 8. It provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. 9. It separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. 10th, it provided for the appointment of the statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into phase. ओके फ्रेंड्स, आपण इथंपर्यंतचा भाग कंप्लीट केलेला आहे. तर आपण सायमन कमिशनपर्यंत पोहोचलेलो आहोत. हा भाग तुम्हाला कसा वाटला हे तुम्ही नक्की कमेंटमध्ये सांगा. आणि तुम्हाला याच्यापुढेही असं लक्ष्मीकांतचं लेक्चर ऐकायचं असेल तर ते देखील सांगा. आपण ते देखील कंटिन्यू करण्याचा प्रयत्न करू. थँक्यू.